Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel, which is strong encryption more important now than ever? I'm Gary Davis. I'm Apple's Senior Director of Privacy. After coming to CPDP for many years, I have now been promoted to Moderator, which is a fantastic outcome for me because I have very little to do. My panelists will in fact do all the work, it seems to me. But great privilege for me to be here and to moderate this. Encryption is obviously an issue which is near and dear to Apple. Over many years, as you will all know, we have taken principled public stands on the issue and continue to expand the scope of where we offer encryption in our products and services. This is undoubtedly something which my colleague Erik, who I'll introduce shortly, will touch upon, so I'm not going to spend much of your time referring to it. This panel offers us a perhaps unique opportunity at CPDP this year to identify areas where the privacy and law enforcement communities can engage and work together in terms of access to data in the context of law enforcement goals. In that respect, I very much appreciate Edvardas joining us and coming into the lion's den, as it were, and putting forward his views. I think the panel is a much better place because of it. And this type of engagement, from our perspective, can only lead to better outcomes from all of our perspectives. And with that, I'm now going to introduce our panel members. And you will note there is one not here, but I will explain that shortly. So Namrata Maheshwari is Asia Pacific Policy Council at Access Now and leads their global policy work on encryption. Prior to joining Access Now, she worked with the Center for Democracy and Technology as a consultant, focusing on the Freedom, Security and Technology project. She has an LLM from Columbia Law School and received her law degree from Jindal Global Law School. My colleague Erik Neuenschwander is Apple's Director of User Privacy, in charge of privacy engineering efforts across all of Apple's products and services. Erik's organization supports teams throughout the company to help design many of its privacy protections features. His team focuses on privacy by default, including data minimization, technical limits on data use, application of data protection, on-device processing, and privacy-preserving technologies. That's a lot, Erik. Erik has over 18 years of experience in software technology, including roles at Microsoft and for the last 16 years, in fact, at Apple. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Symbolic Systems and an MA in Philosophy from Stanford, and was a teaching fellow in Stanford's Community Science Department. Edvardas Šileris is head of the European Cybercrime Center, where he is responsible for the central collection of criminal intelligence on cybercrime across the EU. Among other things, his teams at the Cybercrime Center provide digital and document forensic support in complex cases across EU strategic analysis of threats and trends, liaison with industry, that's why he's here, I guess, academia, also that, and non-law enforcement partners, prevention and awareness raising, and capacity building. Edvardas was previously Deputy Police Commissioner General of the Lithuanian Police Force and was in charge of the innovation group within the Lithuanian Police. So we're certainly very pleased to have him here with us. MEP Hannah Neumann would have joined us in person today, but unfortunately her legislative duties called her into a last-minute trilogue, negotiations with the EU member states. However, she was kind enough to provide us with a video intervention, which she recorded for us yesterday. Hannah is the Peace and Human Rights spokesperson of the Greens European Free Alliance Group in the European Parliament. She is Vice Chair and Group Coordinator of the Human Rights Committee, as well as a member of the Committee on Security and Defence Policy. Hannah has a PhD in Media Sciences and Peace and Conflict Studies. Today she will be speaking to us on the video in her capacity as a member of the European Parliament's Special Committee to investigate the use of Pegasus and equivalent surveillance spyware. Right, with all of that out of the way, we can now turn to the more interesting part, I guess. And we're going to start with Namrata. Namrata, are new legislative initiatives a real threat to encryption? And if so, are the interests they can protect achievable by other means?
Thank you, Gary, and thank you all so much for your time. I want to start by saying that the stated goals of all these legislative initiatives are very important. They need attention, and of course, online safety is of utmost importance. But there are a few reasons why these legislative proposals that target encryption are misfires. They would force encrypted platforms to develop the ability to detect or scan content. The absence of this ability is in fact a defining feature of end-to-end encryption. It is what allows people to truly communicate securely while protecting their free expression and right to privacy. The assumption that access would only be allowed to specific content as and when needed, and the platform can otherwise be end-to-end encrypted, is flawed. There is no such thing as mostly end-to-end encrypted. A platform is either end-to-end encrypted or it is not. And complying with these proposals would mean that they cease to be so, to the detriment of everybody's privacy and security. When these measures are implemented, it will lead to very problematic scenarios. Because the scanning tool is essentially a vulnerability that could be misused and exploited by a range of bad actors. So in a way, it would turn what would have been a bug into a feature. There is then what I think of, well, at least since the Oscars, as the everything, everywhere, all at once problem. Because the scanning ability cannot be selectively deployed, it will lead to general and indiscriminate scanning of everybody's messages. This goes against all human rights principles of necessity and proportionality and risks treating every single user as a potential criminal. Naturally, just the idea that all of your private messages could be scanned has a stifling effect on free speech and violates privacy. So in that sense, privacy is like justice. It must not only be had, but it must also be seen to be had. There is then the everywhere part of the problem. Despite the best intentions of any government proposing these measures, these tools will be upscaled and repurposed to scan all types of content, including, for example, political dissent. It is tempting to think of this as somebody else's problem, as something that would only happen in a faraway country with less stringent human rights protections. But the way cross-border communications work and the way our technology travels, the stifling effect will be felt across the board by all the millions of users who rely on encryption, because at the end of the day, the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. These proposals also have an underlying reliance on artificial intelligence and machine learning tools to identify content. It is dangerous to rely on these technologies to serve as a silver bullet that would solve the admittedly difficult challenges of content moderation on encrypted platforms. They are prone to bias, they are prone to misuse, and they are known to return false results, including falsely classifying legitimate expressions of speech like cartoons, war reports, and so on. It's sort of like relying on the future and ruining the present, in that we are trying to rely on the elusive promise of a future technology in a way that will ruin the existing secure technology of encryption. Now, all of these costs have been well demonstrated by people working on the technology, by people working on rights. But I think there isn't enough evidence of the link between these proposed measures and the benefits that they seek to achieve in a way that would justify these severe restrictions on fundamental human rights. So there are questions we need to ask. Will undermining encryption in fact curb the spread of illegal material online? Won't bad actors, for example, just move to other platforms or build their own? What are the costs? Is it necessary or proportionate to deprive millions of the right to privacy? What kind of capacity building initiatives are underway to make sure that the existing powers and access to metadata that law enforcement have are used to the best extent possible? How can platforms strengthen their tools to empower users and develop their trust and safety teams to make sure that the complaints are meaningfully seen through. Finally, these proposals have a lens of tech solutionism in that they rely on technology to solve problems that are primarily social. And this is an issue for two reasons. One, it takes away from the need for resources for social care and intervention to prevent these issues. And two, we are relying on platforms and private companies to give us solutions that will have a deep impact on fundamental rights, many of whom we actually need greater transparency and accountability from. In sum, we need to make sure that efforts to solve incident-based harms don't end up resulting in systemic harm, which will happen if these proposals go through, because they will make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to provide end-to-end encryption in a way that will effectively erode confidential communications. I want to emphasize that any threat to encryption is also a threat to human rights, and this has a disproportionate impact for certain communities in certain contexts. Think about a journalist trying to protect the identity of their source, a doctor providing reproductive health care to a young girl, a parent seeking medical advice for their child, or a youth exploring their sexuality. I also want to highlight that especially in the EU, such proposals sort of go against an ecosystem that has so far prioritized people's rights and autonomy and contributed to positive standards around tech regulation globally. The e-privacy directive, for example, protects the confidentiality of communications and recognizes the importance of end-to-end encryption. This is also where several calls have been made against spyware, against which encryption is a very strong safeguard. On multiple occasions, the EU has said that they do not want to backdoor or undermine encryption. Courts have disallowed mass surveillance, including general and indiscriminate screening of metadata. These proposals would require indiscriminate screening of interpersonal communications, which has an even more obvious link to the right to privacy. So the threat to encryption is almost incongruous with rights-oriented trends and would likely fail in any assessment that weighs the impact on human rights. I think that's my time. Thank you so much, and I'll pass the mic back to you.
Thank you very much, Namrata. Moving to you now, Erik. I heard lots of interesting points made by Namrata there, but one thing actually caught my attention in the context of your intervention. Namrata said the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. What are the technical limitations that should be considered to support the view that strong encryption cannot have, weakest links, vulnerabilities built into them?
Right, thank you. And thank you everybody for joining our panel. I appreciate your time and attention. I agree, I heard a lot of good in what Namrata said. And this is a challenging problem. So encryption is part of the security which is foundational to assuring privacy. It's not sufficient to assure privacy. You have to do more beyond that. Gary touched on data minimization as a key approach. But you need strong security as a foundation to be able to provide and enforce those other things that support privacy. And encryption is a really critical part of that. Encryption helps provide that confidentiality that lets people, as Namrata said, have their free expression and be able to feel safe about expressing themselves. And so fundamentally, right, encryption is rendering data into an unreadable format. And so it has two critical pieces to support that. You need the strong math of the algorithm that's actually doing that, so that only someone in possession of a decryption key is able to recover that content. And that's that second point, and frequently where the weakest link is, about that key. The key needs to be unguessable, so it needs to be long, it needs to be random, you can pretty much handle that. But then it needs to be managed so that the key doesn't fall into the hands of anyone who should not be able to read the content. So we've thought about this a lot across our products. We provide strong support for encryption built in. So we have many third-party applications on our devices that help provide encrypted data, encrypted storage, encrypted communications. And of course, we've deployed some of this technology ourselves. So we think a lot about strong data protection on the device because devices leave people's personal possession and the data needs to be safe even when that's true. We also think about it from communication standpoint. So we have iMessage with end-to-end encrypted messages. We have FaceTime with both audio and video end-to-end encrypted communication. And then we think about the storage even when it's in the cloud. Obviously, the transmission of the cloud, the transmission of web technology or web traffic has to be encrypted. But then once it's in the cloud, typically it's been very challenging to provide strong encryption there. And by strong, I mean in a way where the provider of that cloud service can't have undue access to your data. When we think about iCloud, it's primarily a backup service for the user and synchronization between the user's devices. And with a lot of work, it was only at the end of last year in December that we launched something we call Advanced Data Protection in iCloud, which is a setting anyone can now turn on to bring end-to-end encrypted storage into iCloud so that Apple does not possess the key required to recover the data in iCloud. That had one technical challenge, or really a usability challenge for us, because as a backup service, you also want to be able to get your data back. The bad thing that can happen is that someone can come in and steal your data, put it on the internet, ransom it. That's very bad. It's equally bad if you, as the actual authorized user, can't get your photos, your documents back to you. And so we had to deploy additional recovery methods that people can turn on so that they can have high confidence and we can have high confidence that they will be able to get back to their material. But that leaves the keys in the hands of the user on their trusted devices. That's the highest protection that we know how to give the keys. And that's then fundamentally the friction with any kind of extraordinary access or scanning proposal, is that if the key's only in the possession of the user on the user's trusted devices, that means it's unlikely to fall into bad hands, but it means it's also unavailable and therefore the data is unavailable for other uses. We think about making the choice that way because the devices, the computers, they don't know who is trying to decrypt the data. The math doesn't know who or for what purpose the data is being decrypted. And so the key in the possession of anyone functions the same way. And so trying to manage a key in a method where you ensure that only the good people have access to it and none of the bad people have access to it is a challenge no one has been able to surmount. We're able to say that the one person that we know who should have rights to that data for sure is the user. So we can put the key on the user's trusted devices, leave it in their control, and be assured that the user who must have access to that data is able to have access to that data. But once you try to relax that constraint and say, well, but the key should actually be available in these other good situations that don't involve the user. The key should actually be available to other actors other than the user for good uses. At that point, it stops being a matter that technology can solve because there's no way to tell when that key is being used, the purpose it's being used for. So that's what we continue to struggle with when it comes to encryption and anything that would be said to still provide strong encryption when the key is not controlled as closely as possible. Now, that said, I'm still optimistic if we take our minds off of just trying to find ways into encrypted data and instead think about the wealth of other data, of metadata, of other investigative techniques to still do our part to enable law enforcement to find criminals, to prosecute crimes. That's an important role that we have to play. But certainly I agree with Namrata that when it comes to thinking about ways to redesign encryption for that use, I don't think there's been any technical proposal which manages to preserve end-to-end encryption while allowing for extraordinary access. With that, I'll hand it back to Gary.
Thank you very much, Erik. The good news is we're making good time as we go. So Edvardas, you can certainly feel free to take a little bit of time to respond to some of the points that have been made. I did hear Namrata also highlight in her intervention about focusing on existing measures that can be strengthened in terms of law enforcement's access to metadata that may in fact be helpful in this space. And so I guess the opening question to you is, how can legitimate policy goals be balanced with privacy and data protection rights, which I know Europol is also focused on?
Thank you very much. I cannot agree more with previous speakers. In general, we are pro-privacy and we don't argue for less encryption. We argue for strong encryption. But our main message is that law enforcement need to have legitimate access to data, one way or another. For sure, we need to agree on principles. That's why I have 3 questions to audience as well. What do you think? Actually, please raise hands who thinks that from now on, we need to have even more privacy compared to what we have today. Okay, less privacy? No one? Okay, balanced approach, 50-50. So it means that actually truth somewhere in the middle. No, so more privacy by default. Okay, nice start. Here I will start with one interesting example. As Gary introduced me, I am a Lithuanian national, and in my previous role, I was Deputy Police Commissioner. At that time, I don't remember where it was exactly, maybe 8-9 years ago, there was interesting directive, PNI directive. We as law enforcement, we like acronyms. So PNI goes to Passenger Name Register. And at that time, law enforcement, we wanted to have access to data collected by airlines, for example, who is flying where. And the main purpose was to fight serious organized crime and terrorism. And usually when you arrest criminals, you need to collect everything what you are able to collect, and then actually to merge to find some cross matches, etc. And the main discussion was for how long do we need to have this data in our servers. Main agreement was reached with Europarlament that two weeks it's enough. As law enforcement representative, I would say 2 weeks, you know, it's a bit too short. Usually we have for much more, we need to have actually. And then suddenly few terrorist attacks appeared. One in Brussels here, second one in Paris. Within 30 days, Europarlament reached agreement that it's sufficient to keep this data for 5 years. 5 years, it's really sufficient time for law enforcement to go through, to connect, to detect links, etc. So it was first time when I started to think, okay, what had changed when till these terrorist attacks happens, and for example, from legislative point of view. So actually nothing. People started to believe, people started to challenge a bit different things. And then they realize that no matter of everything, we cannot be so extreme and support one side and not to pay attention to another one. Because actually, what we can do? For time being, I live in a nice place in Hague. Gary, Gary just before this panel asked, will I stay in Hague? I said probably no, but for the next 6 years, probably yes. And actually, I started to think about privacy. Would it possible to be imagined that in Hague or in Brussels, there is house, no matter what is going on in this house, it's impossible to law enforcement to have access to this house at any circumstances. No matter, someone is shooting, someone is raping kids, whatever. So I started to think probably no. One way or another, we need to find ways how to address this issue. So we don't want to break end-to-end encryption, for sure no, because actually if you put on weights, for sure end-to-end encryption has many good things to deliver, and actually we rely on it as well as law enforcement. So in this regard, no, but before that, I think that we need to agree on principles. And if we agree on principles that as foundation, that law enforcement or states or governments, I don't know how we can describe it in legal terms, but law enforcement needs to have access, and then it's up to technological companies to come with suggestions to, for example, for academia as well, how we can achieve it one way or another. And then actually, if society is satisfied, then it's okay. Because sometimes strange questions appear when people start to think that it's law enforcement demands this access. In general, no. Last year at Europol, we had the main topic for our cybercrime conference with name Social Contract in Digital Age. So it means that actually it's, we are not selfish in general. So we want to fulfill our duties properly. And actually we are servant of society. So imagine situation, for example, if there is emergency services, who can come to situation only, for example, 2 hours per day, not 24 hours when you need support and help, but just 2 hours. Because this example clearly illustrates some proposals rely on vulnerabilities. If you are able to detect those, you can, of course, access some data, because there is vulnerabilities and there will be vulnerabilities, it's for sure. It's how code is written. It's not intentionally, but all the time we see some patches. So here I think that it's not the sustainable way how to do it. And I would like to finish my maybe main message. Imagine situation, for example, privacy by default, so it means that we don't have any ability to access data. Your neighbor or someone, his daughter is kidnapped when she went from school. And for example, would you allow for police to access data of all surroundings of this area where crime was committed? Because we have traditional methods how to tackle it, for example, surveillance cameras, witnesses, we can go around, but actually in many cases, I would say more than 50% success leads to digital evidences in 21st century. It's natural, everyone holds a phone, everyone communicates, etc. So we don't need to have massive surveillance, we don't need that, but we need to have legitimate access to data, one way or another. But here, for sure, we need to do first step, so we need to agree on principles, and if we agree on principles, we can proceed forward how. But first question is if, or do you allow us? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Edvardas. I was probably kind of hoping you'd say no support for end-to-end encryption, in fact, and then we would have got into a big debate. So it's probably reassuring, therefore, that you're showing support for it and laying out some principles. And we might return to those, actually, if we have a little bit more time on the panel, which we may well do. So now, as I indicated, Hannah was not able to join us, but she did take the opportunity to record a video. And so if we could have the video from Hannah now, that would be great, please.
Good morning. My name is Hannah Neumann. I'm a member of the European Parliament, and I was negotiating the Pegasus inquiry report and recommendations for the Greens. First of all, please accept my apologies that I can't be with you today. I was called in for a trilogue meeting last minute in the European Parliament, and well, I'm kind of sad to say that this will maybe more and more often happen to us, members of the European Parliament, as we look into just 1 year of activities before the elections and before we have to conclude all important files. So again, please accept my apologies, but I decided to just send you a video to at least inform you about the work that we did and do in the Parliament when it comes to Pegasus, so the misuse of commercial spyware by European Union governments, but also by governments all around the world, and what we in Parliament think the European Union, the member states' governments, but also companies should do to prevent such massive misuse in the future. First of all, the Pegasus scandal, and by now it's not just Pegasus, but it's a number of other kinds of commercial spyware as well, has clearly shown us two things. First of all, once such a powerful technique is on the market, no one is safe from misuse. What we kind of expected to happen in autocracies, in dictatorial regimes, that they misuse this powerful tool to spy on political opponents, to spy on journalists, to spy on lawyers, also happened inside the European Union, in some of the most democratic countries in global comparison, and it didn't just happen in 1 or 2 cases, but we clearly see a systemic pattern of abuse in Hungary, in Poland, in Greece and Cyprus, in Spain. At the moment, the use of spyware is out of control inside the European Union. And you can clearly see that once such powerful technique is available, once there are security vulnerabilities that are being used by commercial spyware producers, it can even lead to a very cumbersome situation that while you as a government, for example, spy on opposition forces, on separatist movements in your own country, someone else, like a third country government, spies on you based on the same technologies, the same vulnerabilities, which clearly shows that we have to close these vulnerabilities. We have to stop this misuse of commercial spyware, because really no one is safe from being spied upon at the moment. That was one of the key areas on which the Parliament worked. And the second aspect, and this also relates directly to the issue of encryption, is quite a fundamental democratic question that comes with it. I mean, in democracies, we kind of think, well, but it's the good guys, so the democratic governments that are in the control of these technologies. But, I mean, first of all, do we know if the good guys, the democratic governments, will always be the ones in place? Or, for example, if we see right-wing actors taking over power, if we see people taking over power who really want to undermine democracy while they are in power, are we then safe if these technologies are in place? And for me, the check of whether I want to advocate for something to happen, like, for example, for spyware with certain functionalities to be used, the check always is, would I still feel confident if the AfD in Germany, for example, our right-wing party, would be in power and be at the possession of these powerful tools? And well, frankly said, if you do this, let's say, nasty government check, you quite quickly come to different conclusions and approaches, which is why also I think our report has ended up being as strong as it is, because many of us, in the process of learning how much technologies can be abused, and well, how much they are being abused, even in European democracies, have come to those conclusions that it is very important that we regulate them strongly. In this regard, we have a number of demands. For example, that, well, it kind of sounds absurd, but we are not there. If member states want to continue using spyware, they have to comply with the legal requirements set out by the European Union treaties, fundamental rights, but also European Court of Justice rulings. We say that certain professions shouldn't be spied upon, such as journalists, doctors, politicians. When it comes to their professional communication, we say that we need more redress and remedy for victims. I mean, you can go through all of it, but we have also a quite clear language on encryption, where the recommendations include a specific section on e-privacy, where we call, and I'm just going to quote, for the protection of all electronic communications, content and metadata against the abuse of personal data and private communications by private companies and government authorities. That's quite important. I really think we need to work closer together. Sometimes maybe even private companies have to, let's say, control and criticize governments, which some of the companies that are sponsorship do, or government authorities have to, of course, supervise and criticize private companies where necessary. So again, the protection of all electronic communications, content and metadata against the abuse of personal data and private communications by private companies and government authorities. And we point out that digital safety by design tools such as end-to-end encryption should not be weakened. I hope this serves, well, first of all, to raise your interest and the work that we have done in the Pegasus Inquiry Committee. We will vote on the recommendations, so like the political demands basically to the Commission and the Member States in the June plenary, so that was most likely going to be June 14. And then we are increasing pressure on the Commission to come forward with some quite clear-cut regulation that picks up our recommendations so that we really get this, well, I would say this field gone rogue a bit back into political control, always led by the interest to protect the fundamental rights of European citizens, but also to live up to our global responsibility, so to make sure that at least we do not contribute, if not even stop autocracies and dictatorial regimes from misusing spyware against their own internal political opposition.
It's gone. Okay, great. We thank Hannah again for taking the time to provide that intervention to us. I'd just like to summarize, at least for me, some of the themes that I took from it. She's certainly highlighting for all of us here sitting in Brussels today that there is a threat faced from sophisticated attackers using commercial spyware all across Europe. So we should not be complacent here. She also highlighted an issue which I think Erik was highlighting in terms of the machine not knowing who the good guys are from the bad guys. And in the spyware space, it does seem as though it's rather hard to distinguish between who's acting with good intentions and who's acting with bad intentions. She also highlighted, for me at least, that we already have a strong existing legal framework here in Europe that should already be governing whether or not governments and others can legitimately use this sophisticated spyware. She's also highlighting, and I think Birgit Sippel, if she was here, would be very happy, the role of the e-privacy regulation. I was at an event on Tuesday evening that I think many of you that I see here were at, where Birgit was making an impassioned plea for life support and resuscitation for the e-privacy regulation. So maybe this will be a further boost to that, and certainly something which we in Apple have been calling for some considerable period of time also. And I also heard, encouragingly, that the committee will be voting on the 14th of June. And we can look forward to the outcome of its work in the plenary at the Parliament, and we can look forward to the outcome of its work, perhaps having some strong influence in this space. So, Erik, after that summary, turning to you, I think Hannah's intervention, and I think this was pretty well known, but it certainly brings it home to us, shows that there is a very well-formed market to circumvent encryption outside of legitimate law enforcement needs that Edvardas has talked to us about. How are civil society and companies responding to this? And Namrata, you should certainly feel free to chime in if you wish at the end of Erik's intervention.
Yeah, I think there were three things, in addition to what Gary was talking about, that I heard there that touch on our topic, which is number one, and as you said, it is, I think, well known, but there is a real problem with this. These technologies are quite powerful and way too widely available and are widely misused. So it points out two things. That one, like Edvardas said, there is no perfect, you didn't use the words perfect security, but you talked about flaws in the software, unintentional flaws in the software, and this is true. Complicated software will have flaws in it. So that the existence of these tools only exists through exploitation of that, and it shows that we have more work to do. And that's the second theme, I think, which is that some people take a position that we in technology or the designs have done enough, that we have good security, that we have good enough privacy, and that nothing more needs to be done. I think that this shows that the attackers and the attacks only get stronger over time. The protections you design into a system only get weaker over time. And so to stand still is really to fall behind. In fact, if you want to even maintain the same level of security and privacy protections for users, for people, then you have to be moving forward. And ideally, you want to do even better than that. You want to stay ahead of the attackers and the attacks. You know, if you think about, I believe all of us have noticed that there's a lot more in the news about data breaches. You may be receiving a lot more notifications yourself for entities that you transacted with years ago, and the numbers back that up. Data breaches are growing rapidly and hitting more and more people. More and more of our data is online. It's available in digital form. We transact and we do more things online, and the attackers well know this. They know that they can get a good ransomware opportunity by going after that data online. And so I touched on at the beginning that Apple's launched advanced data protection for iCloud with a recognition that while there hasn't been a breach of iCloud that resulted in the disclosure of user data, nobody's gotten into the servers and pulled that data out, it doesn't make sense to think about that as a forever situation. We have to move forward, and we have to get to a state where, even if an attacker does breach a company's cloud systems, that the data that they find there is encrypted and they cannot find the keys because the keys are not with that provider. I think it's important to keep moving forward in these dimensions because it means that that's the way that we will keep people safe against the increasingly strong attacks. Now, when it comes to state-sponsored mercenary spyware, like we were talking about, Apple, we currently have a lawsuit in process against the NSO group. We also have continually the security team's work to improve, to find the flaws in the software, to take flaws that are reported to us and get fixes out. Edvardas also mentioned, there seems to be a regularity to patches. This is the state of play, that you find and you fix these vulnerabilities, you keep on moving forward. But in addition to that, we took a step a little over a year ago now with something called lockdown mode, which is an optional extreme level of security people can enable on their devices. It actually changes the functionality of the device in a way that reduces the attack surface for those few people, and it really is few people, but those who need the protection because they will be the target of one of these spyware technologies. We heard very much how it gets used against journalists, used by oppressive regimes against dissidents. And so that kind of audience are the kind who should consider putting their device into this mode where they're trading a little bit of functionality for that increased protection to really reduce the attack surface against these particular kinds of attacks. But then there's more to be done on top of that. Outside of the technological realm, we're working with Citizen Lab and the Ford Foundation, and we've increased our security bounty for flaws in lockdown mode to try to get more attention on this space and to try to develop new techniques to help protect users. And I think that this is all, at least in my mind, in a way very supportive of law enforcement because these abuses of the technology are crimes in themselves and people are harmed by these technologies stealing their data. And so it's a case where I think there is opportunity and good working together to both protect users against this and then help in the prosecution of these when they happen. Namrata, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure, I think you've covered most of it, but there are three things that the current market for spyware and the rampant use highlight. One is that it would flip the status quo. So right now, spyware is used through flaws. It is targeted through vulnerabilities, like Erik said, in the system. If we implement the proposals that target encryption, we will make that the status quo instead of somebody having to kind of work their way through a security weakness in the door. We will hand them the key to the lock in that door. And the current use of spyware, I think, gives us a very good trailer of what will become normal if these proposals go through. The second is just a quick glance at the kind of people who are targeted by the use of spyware. It's journalists, politicians, government officials, people in high-profile public roles in democracies also, including the world's largest democracy. So it makes it very clear that the moment this vulnerability is made part of the system, these are the kind of people who will stand to lose the most in addition to other vulnerable communities in repressive regimes. And number three, as I think Erik also highlighted, it does not matter what the intention of the government is. It will be used by other governments and other countries that may not be as well-intentioned. Once the tech exists, it exists for everybody across the board. So we simply cannot look at policy and tech in the kind of regional sense that may have worked so far as encryption is concerned. Edvardas?
Do you wish to, well, I have a detailed question for you, but I'm happy for you to come in on the back of this.
Maybe just small remark that actually we speak about misuse of technology. Actually, it's a legitimate thing. So it goes similarly to different things, to cars, to weapons, to military, to whatever. Actually, it's a legal thing and illegal. So I agree that actually it's bad things going on with this, and we are not arguing to target politicians, journalists, diplomats, whatever. Actually, no. We speak about legal access to data, only legal one, and actually that if we agree on principle here, we can proceed. Otherwise, actually, it's discussion to nowhere. For sure, someone will misuse Apple devices as well, and they're using them as well. So here I think that nothing to add.
Do I take it, therefore, that you don't support the exploitation of vulnerabilities as a way for law enforcement to pursue its legitimate aims?
In general, I support all the means which allows legitimate access to data. And with vulnerabilities, I don't see here systematic approach, because as with that example with emergency services, because you are not 100% sure that you know these vulnerabilities. For example, imagine, today I know how to tackle Apple devices, or not Apple, but whatever, with end-to-end encryption with true vulnerabilities. Tomorrow this vulnerability is patched. Today we rescued some kidnapped kid, tomorrow no, because actually we don't know how to attack this one. So actually it's not the sustainable solution. In general it's possible, and these companies showed clearly that actually it works, but actually it's not what law enforcement needs, because here actually we are playing this, how to call it, cat and mouse game. Someone is trying to implement something new, someone is trying to overcome it, and actually I don't think that it leads to sustainable solution.
Great, thank you, Edvardas. Erik, actually, in an unscripted question, do you have a view on law enforcement exploiting vulnerabilities in the software?
Well, with Edvardas used the verb support, and I don't think it would be right, I don't think it would be accurate to claim that we support that, because there's nothing active. We don't when we find vulnerabilities, we fix them. We don't slide them over to law enforcement. So I wouldn't think I could say support, but it is the state of play. I mean, the software will have vulnerabilities, and certainly if it can be used under lawful means and to protect people, I think law enforcement has the freedom to do that. It's a regulated freedom, but if the vulnerability exists and you have it should be fixed, but during the time period it exists, if you have a choice between some bad actor using it or some good actor using it, you're gonna come down on the side of the good actor.
Thank you. Turning now to you, Namrata. Is there a way to reframe this conversation around encryption and online safety and, law enforcement pursuing its legitimate aims to move forward and maybe, change the current polarization in the debate?
I agree with Edvardas in principle there. I think a good place to start would be to agree on a set of baseline realities and goals. And I have a few that I can propose. The first is on the role of encryption. Again, we all agree online safety is a real challenge. It needs solutions. But encryption is not the villain here. And undermining it in any way will do more harm than good. Second, policies need to stop relying on the privacy versus safety narrative. The idea that encryption helps privacy, but we need to let go some of it to ensure safety. This is an absolutely false binary. Privacy and safety are mutually reinforcing, and encryption helps strengthen both of them. Finally, as I've said before, there is no meet me halfway with encryption, end-to-end encryption as of today. It's at best a research question. So any ability to detect content on any encrypted platform is weakening the security of the entire platform for all its users. And the fourth question that I think we need to test all proposed measures against is this may solve certain incident-based harms, one that also needs proof, but two, even if it does, are we instead creating a platform that will perpetuate systemic harm? So I think if we were to start, of course there will be many more, and this is an ongoing conversation, but if we were to agree on these baseline realities, we could move forward to multi-stakeholder conversations between civil society, platforms, law enforcement, security experts on how to maximize the potential of existing solutions and how to devise new solutions. I also think, since Edvardas, you brought up some offline examples, I do think that there is value in remembering parallels in an offline context. The offline space does offer opportunities for private conversation. We now live most of our lives online, and that is close to impossible to do, but encryption helps us preserve some semblance of that privacy online. Without it, everything we do online is susceptible to prying eyes. Similarly, there are limitations to what investigators can access in the offline space, what private conversations they can or cannot listen to, no matter how effective it would be for investigation purposes, purely because allowing it would be way too invasive for fundamental rights. And I think it is important to contextualize that for encryption and the online world. And finally, a loose analogy, but one that I find useful to think about, is airbags in a car. They are an essential safety feature, but sometimes they are linked to injuries when they inflate. But it would be misplaced to say we should remove airbags to ensure safety, just as it would be misplaced to say we should undermine encryption to ensure safety, because sometimes it is linked to unfortunate consequences. Admittedly, a loose analogy, but since we're talking about the offline world, of course there are unique challenges in the online world, but there is not a complete absence, I think, of parallels, legal principles, and human rights limitations in our offline world as well.
Of course, Edvardas, you will certainly have an ability to come back, hopefully at Lent, in fact.
I really like your analogy with airbags. I think that we must provide airbags to victims, because for time being they are driving cars without airbags.
Well, that's a nice analogy to turn it around. Did you want a broader response to the points, or do you want to move on to where we were intended to be headed right now?
Maybe it's personal view, because with digitalization, we reach some huge scale. So here's the main issue, because in offline world, actually, if we speak about one car, one airbag, whatever, actually it's impossible to reach all the planet. And here with one single solution or with one single decision, we can scale to everyone. And here I think that actually that's why we have this discussion, everything or nothing, nothing in between. So one way or another, as I mentioned before, we need to find this one, and we need to conduct fair social contracts between society, what society expects, because in the end of the day, it's our own need, not personal one, but from all the society. So that's why actually, and I think that technological companies should follow it as well. So far we are satisfied with our status quo, we can proceed. And unfortunately, it's my lesson learned from 28 years of service in law enforcement. Unfortunately, we do proper conclusions after tragedies, one way or another. And that's why, for example, in US, after colonial pipelines, it was grabbed huge attention towards ransomware. Before that, it was only warnings from law enforcement, but when everyone realized that it's impossible to refuel, actually it became a problem, and right now it seems that some real good decisions are coming.
I think we'd have to agree with that. Having conversations outside of just responding to particular incidents is certainly, I think, in all of our interests in trying to have these conversations, which is partly why we're here this morning, I feel. Edvardas, a few years back, it was announced that the European Commission would be providing some funding to Europol to develop some expertise with a decryption platform. That's maybe 4 years ago now, I think. Has that actually been in any way successful? And Erik might be taking a lot of notes based on your answer. So can you give us some insight into how that has worked out as a potential solution in this space?
I would say yes. It is an extremely successful project. We provide decryption services to our member states in investigations which we are supporting. But the main issue here, as I said, it is not systematic solution. So I would give different analogy to COVID vaccines. everyone needs them, not only 0.0001% of population. So in general, we have more than 50% success rates to decrypt some data, which were contributed to Europol. But figures are really, really low compared to cases or compared to demand. So in general, it's a solution, but it's not a silver bullet to address it. But in general, we as Europol, we are really proud that we have it, and I think that it's a really good tool to be used by law enforcement.
Thank you very much for that. I will turn to questions from the audience in a minute or so, but Namrata, you've come here to us today from India, and you have a global role for Access now. How would you benchmark or situate for us here the debate on encryption in Europe compared to other regions around the world currently?
There are definitely similarities. Jurisdictions are very clearly borrowing from each other in how they are looking at solving these problems or addressing these issues, whether it is traceability in India, Brazil, and Bangladesh, or scanning in the EU and the US, the UK. The similarities are, again, there is an assumption that there is a tech-based solution that platforms and technologists will bring forward. There is also the purpose, the stated purpose for a lot of these legislations is better content governance, is better accountability from the private sector, but the net effect does sometimes become a loss for privacy. There's also a dichotomy in that we frequently hear lawmakers and governments say that they do not want to weaken end-to-end encryption, but the effect of policies that are coming forward is that it would weaken end-to-end encryption. So there is that dichotomy also that we are trying to engage with. But there are equally very important differences. First is, of course, on the nature of the regime. Depending on how authoritarian or democratic a particular country is, it really depends on the level of engagement with civil society, privacy advocates, private sector, and how much of that makes its way into policy in a meaningful way. The second is on the privacy jurisprudence. Is there a legislation that protects the right to privacy? Is there a constitution where the fundamental right to privacy is protected? Have there been judgments from the higher courts in the country that kind of build this jurisprudence, and how is it enforced? And finally, conversations and debates more recently around spyware also help a great deal. To what extent are public authorities calling for accountability on these things, pushing for security measures like encryption that will protect the people who tend to be targeted by spyware? And especially on these last 2 points, or all these differences, in fact, I think there are opportunities for the EU for productive engagement, like I think this panel, to bring together different views and make sure that policies are evolved, keeping in mind the best interest and everybody's fundamental rights at the center of focus.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so we do have a little bit of time. I do have some questions I can pose to the panelists if you're a shy audience and they're not feeling the need to ask questions, but we'll also very happily take questions if anybody has it. I see one. Thank you very much. Feel free to introduce yourself. Also feel free to choose to protect your identity.
Thank you. My name is Christian Reimsbach and I work at the OECD. And I have a question related to, sorry, I have to pick. Yes, it was exactly Namrata, sorry, who basically said there is no halfway solution when it comes to the issues we are talking about. And I understand where this statement is coming from, obviously related to the exploitation of, sorry, can I pick my notebook here? The exploitation of vulnerabilities and backdoors. But obviously, there are ways to allow the use of, let's say, personal data and protecting privacy while still fighting crime. And here I was obviously thinking of the CSAM initiative of Apple. And I was wondering if maybe we could bring that initiative also in the conversation, because I was expecting maybe to hear about that. So basically, when it comes to the detection of child sexual and abusive material, And if we could talk about that, thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Maybe that's going to be for Erik, but maybe let me frame it. I also note you were very trusting to hand over your iPad, I hope it was, just there. So that was end-to-end encryption in practice. And you got it back and everything seems fine. So Erik, Apple announced an initiative in August 2021. Can you give us an update on that?
Yeah, sure, and Namrata may have comments on it as well. I think Access now had a position. So as Gary says, we did make an announcement of a hybrid client-server methodology for doing scanning of photos that would be stored in the iCloud Photo Service. We announced that in August 2021. Probably for this kind of audience, many of you were aware of that. And what we heard back was that despite the whatever fanciness in the technology and despite our intentions, that people appreciate and understand that their devices are their own. And the content on their devices, they did not appreciate and did not want a kind of feature that was going to reach in any way at all. And so subsequently, we held many conversations, including with Access Now, but many groups, law enforcement, victim societies, civil society. And after gathering all that feedback, some time ago, we announced that we are not moving forward with that part of the initiative. In the meantime, we have launched in December of last year, I think, and continuing through with multiple regions, something we call communication safety, which is firmly based on the device for users to be able to have their device do some detection and then enable and empower users to reach out. We have also announced that in an upcoming release, and you may know that we have a developer conference coming up in June, so these timings seem aligned, that we would be expanding that to include more applications on the device. It started off just in messages. There are obviously other ways to communicate. That we would expand it to support detection in videos, not just images, because this is also an avenue for abuse, and that we are going to open it up as a function that third-party applications on the device can rely upon to do the same on-device detection using the model that we've developed that runs there, and then be able to empower their users in their applications and with their experiences to be able to reach out. To not go on too long about this, I'd say that the part that I know we still need to do more on is to make that effective for users. This is a challenge with law enforcement and the volume of reports, and it doesn't do the user a lot of good if they can't then carry that forward to law enforcement, and law enforcement to then be able to go after and take action against somebody who might be seeking to abuse children. This is a challenging method of resourcing, and in addition to the technology, and the area that I think we need to do the most more in.
Great. Thank you very much, Erik. You certainly will get to go next. I wanted to give Namrata an opportunity to respond to the question. Also, if she wishes, you don't need to. I'm perfectly fine with that, too.
Just to very quickly add, I think to clarify, Christian, the idea is, of course, not that there should never be any access to any information, any data whatsoever. The idea is just how do we create a framework that maximizes the potential of this access, keeping in mind the legal restrictions and human rights principles that have to be enforced to make sure that we're not creating a solution that will ultimately harm more people than it will do any good. So that's the idea. And I think with all these previous proposals and the current ones that we're seeing, the problem was that it did not meet this threshold. It was admittedly going to cause a lot more harm to human rights than any hypothetical benefit it would have had.
Yeah, hi. Hi, this is Yashu. Hello from Leiden University. Erik, I think, could you please share some thoughts on post-quantum crypto encryption, because research is being done on encryption which quantum will not be able to break. And will any effect trickle down to users in their daily lives? Because Apple is also working on this, right?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, we're working on it. I'm not going to go into any more detail about that. You say, will any effect trickle down to users? I could answer either yes or no. I would say no in the sense of I don't think users will or should notice any difference. The actual algorithm that underpins encryption, while it's critical that we as an industry move forward and have techniques that will be hardened against quantum computing, that's not a user's concern. But in the sense, will an effect trickle down to users? Well, of course. If it turns out that the encryption that we all rely upon today becomes too weak to support the kinds of protections that we enjoy today, we will have moved forward, ideally, on the right timeline. We'll move past that so that users don't have that experience, and they will continue to be protected even as the attempt or the ability to undermine encryption gets stronger. So it's of critical importance, and it's great for you to bring it up in this audience. It's probably in the know on topics like that. To the general population, I hope it's a non-event.
It seems as though the queues for lunch, Bianca, are calling some of our audience away. Yeah, maybe I presume it's not the content of the panel, which I think has been actually better than I even thought in advance. Did we have any other volunteers who wish to pose a question for any of our members of the panel or make an observation? Here in the middle, helpfully from a microphone perspective. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Neeti. I'm from Leiden University as well, and I'm from India. And I completely agree with what Namrata said about jurisdictions borrowing from each other. And this is more of an observation and less of a question. But I feel that given the Brussels effect, it's also important for EU in considering these kind of legislations to look at its impact across the world. And to what extent is that a consideration when these legislative initiatives are formed? Because I'm also from the largest democracy, but it doesn't always work as utopian as you would consider it.
I think that's a great question, and if we had Hannah here, no, I'll pass it. Yeah. If we had Hannah here, I think she would probably wholeheartedly agree with you in terms of the EU needing to understand the broader impact of legislation that it brings forward in the world outside. But Namrata, you can certainly speak to it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that observation. And just to build on that, a lot of these proposals are centered on child safety and children's rights. And the very suggestion that you just made about any policy, keeping in mind the Brussels effect, looking at the kind of impact it could have outside the boundaries of the region, this is also coming from groups working on children's rights and child safety. There are reports from these groups saying also that we cannot look at it simply in the privacy versus safety manner, because then we miss the impact that encryption has on the whole range of rights, even of children. And they specifically recommend that whenever you are devising a policy, please consider what impact they could have outside of your region. Thank you.
Edvardas, we haven't heard from you in a while. Surprisingly, there haven't been any awkward questions for you from the panel. If they're from the audience, if there's no other questions, oh, there are. Okay. All right. Prior to the questions, did you want to add anything over the last while from what you've heard?
Just a recent example. Last Monday, we arrested one pedophile after 9 years, and he abused his son for 9 years. And we started internal discussion, is it success or is it failure for law enforcement? Because we knew for 9 years, he published everything online, he used end-to-end encryption, famous devices as well. We arrested finally, but after 9 years. So I don't know, it's just a rhetorical question.
Thank you. On the outside, your hand went up slightly before the gentleman in the white shirt. So it's outside, then white shirt, sunglasses on head. There you go.
Hi, great to be here and listen to all of you. I love this panel. I'm Linda, also from Leiden University. So my question is, right now the DMA already entered into force and the Article 7 mandate the interoperability between the interpersonal communication services, basically the instant messages, right? So if you want to make the messages interoperable between different platforms, then as far as I know, like encryption will be a problem. So I'm not sure if any of you are considering this issue. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think I can actually probably take that question. Any other panel member can feel free to chime in. Yes, we're aware of the provision. I am pleased to say there is explicit recognition in Article 7.3 of the requirement for any such interoperability to maintain privacy and security. So I think this is an example of the EU legislative process recognizing that while it has a higher level policy goal, it absolutely wishes to maintain high standards of security and privacy.
Actually, I would just add one. You called out the encryption as being a challenge. Sure, yes. I don't even think it's the greatest one. I think the ideas around how user discovery should work, how spam detection and fraud moderation would work. There are a number of challenges even on top of the encryption to have a system that would actually still provide the kind of value that people have today with interoperability added in. So it's a large effort and will take a lot of work.
You've taken the sunglasses off. How are we supposed to recognize you? There we go. Okay, so just here, if that's okay. Sorry for making you go up, and then over to the middle then just after that. And I think we will have met our time, which is cool.
Yeah, so I do just have kind of an awkward question then, right? As you get all these intelligence capabilities as a law enforcement agency, right, you do inherently get a lot of power, and you do inherently get a lot of power, right? That you have to look at proportionality in relation to obviously the right to privacy and other fundamental rights. But how do you guarantee that even right now, as an unbiased organization, right, law enforcement agency working both directions, doesn't get politically captured in any way, right? When you give it all these powers to de-encrypt, and you're going to keep going forward. How do you manage that in a sense that you don't give them too much power and you don't give them the ability, let's say, if you Hungary or something of that nature, how do you keep those government officials from abusing it, right? If you do decide to give law enforcement agencies these universal de-encryption powers, how are you going to maintain that over a 20-year period and not allow it to be abused?
Great, thank you. Edvardas, I believe that's for you in terms of the oversight mechanisms of law enforcement in Europol.
Maybe it's not about Europol, because Europol itself, it doesn't have executive power, so we don't use these techniques. So actually it's up to member states and national authorities, but in general as is whole judicial process. So it means that you need to have proper authorization. Usually there are many chains of commands are included in this, and that's why in the end of the day it's judge who decides to allow you to use these tools or not to allow. But for sure, as with any technology, it could be abused. So here I think that it's up to politicians to decide to implement proper balances and safeguards, how to be protected.
Thank you, Edvardas. I'm being told to stop now, unfortunately, so therefore I'm a compliant citizen, so I will follow the rules which are being passed out. Feel free to come up and chat with us at the end. Listen, thank you very much, everybody, for joining in this conversation. We really appreciate your time. Hopefully we've helped to move it forward a little bit and make some connections between us all. And we look forward to coming back next year, which I understand is also going to be likely in May, and maybe we will have made a lot of advancements in the conversation based on this one here today. So thank you very much.